Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's class, How to Draw Fabric, Part 2. This is a continuation of last week's class where we drew fabric in graphite pencils, and in tonight's class we will continue on drawing the fabric using pen and ink. So I called it Part 1 and Part 2, even though we were doing two separate drawings here because I don't want to go too in depth into the preliminary drawing of tonight's class because we spent so much time on that last week. And we're using the same reference images. So I wanted to just move on to talking about the pen and ink and drawing this fabric using the pen and ink because it will take us some time to build up the values that we're going to be adding with the pen and ink. Okay, so I'm going to switch to my tabletop view and get started. But actually, before I do that, I want to mention that there is a bit of a break in between my classes for Michael's here between this class and the next one in April. So we typically have, or I typically have 3 classes per month that I teach for Michael's. And the last one is just going to be on the last Wednesday of the month this month. Since we have 5 Wednesdays in April, uh, just decided to do it that way. So that next class, you can sign up on the Michael's website, wherever you signed up for this one. And it is Flower Studies in Gouache, Part 1. And you can search for that if you're watching later on YouTube on the Michael's website, or I believe Rich has that link he can drop in the chat for you now. So you can make sure you sign up for that one. I'm excited for that gouache class because it's a lovely little flower study that I've been working on. Okay, now I'm going to switch to my tabletop view and go over supplies. Okay, so don't forget to tag your work with the hashtags Make It With Michael's or Michael's Classes wherever you share your work online. And you can find me online by searching my linktree/Adrian Hodge. And you can find links to sign up for the Michael's classes on there. I've got some independent classes that I do on Zoom. One just started this past Monday, but you can sign up to subscribe to my mailing list. You can find out about other independent classes, or sometimes I preview Michael's classes. I've also been writing some content for Substack called Notes from an Art Teacher, where I give lots of tips and tricks and share just insights and musings in my life as an art teacher. Okay, and then here's some of my work on my business cards. So tonight we are using the Artist Loft illustration pens, and I've got a whole bunch of those here off screen. And then we are using the Artist Loft illustration paper, the Bristol Vellum illustration paper. If you don't have this particular paper, that is fine. You can draw on any sketching paper with pens. It's just that this paper is really nice for drawing with pens, and it absorbs the pen in a nice way, and it just elevates the work that you do in pen and ink when you use illustration paper. And then you're also going to want this for our, we'll definitely still do some preliminary sketching. I'm just not going to go as in depth into it as I did last week. So you might want your sketch pad or your drawing pad. I've got an Artist Loft drawing pad here, and I'll be referencing that preliminary drawing from last week to get us started. And I've got my Artist Loft sketching pencils, but we're not going to be using those too much because we're going to be moving on to the pen and ink. But you can always stick to the pencils for as long as you need to, as you're most comfortable, before you move on to the pen and ink. And then we've got the reference photos that I included in a PDF document for last week's class, and same ones for tonight's class. So you should have those. And I just remembered we had an issue with that document last week, but were you able to go ahead and share that again, Rich? with everybody? Okay.
Yes, I did, and I'll be sharing it again shortly.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so I'm just going to review that preliminary drawing that we did last week before we get started here. So what we're going to want to begin drawing with the pen and ink here tonight is just the bare bones or the main shapes of the value shapes that we talked about last week. And I'm just going to continue treating this class as a continuation, even though I know there's always going to be folks who are just joining us, but you can always stick around and then come back uh, later and watch part one if you missed it. But this was where I landed last week on my drawing. We started out doing some, well, we actually didn't start out with this, but we warmed up with this at a certain point in our practice last week. We did some blind contour sketching, and that is a great place to start to loosen up because we really want to get nice and soft with our lines as we draw this fabric. And we're looking at the shapes of the shadows and the shapes of the light. So we did that to warm up at some point or to loosen up. And then let me just find all of my, that was the more completed sketch from that practice. And then we spent quite a bit of time. I don't know how much this is showing. I'm gonna hold it up close to the camera here. All of these elevational shifts that were happening. So we spent quite a bit of time outlining those. I drew those a lot darker on the paper. Let me find that. I think it's just a little lost in my sketchbook here. Mhm. There it is. One page before. Okay, so we talked about these. I mentioned a great YouTube artist and art teacher who I have been inspired by his tutorial on drawing fabric or drapery, Alfonso Dunn. And he talked about these cone shapes, looking for these cone shapes. So I mentioned that as a reference for finding your bearing with drapery or fabric, and talked about how challenging of a subject matter it can be because we don't have a symbol in our brains or the stock image of what we think fabric or drapery is supposed to look like. So we really have to observe it in order to capture the realistic nature of its contours and volume and make it look representational like the drapery. And I talked about how it is very easy to get stuck on these shapes once you start looking at them closely and get a little hard and rigid with your lines, in which case drapery could easily start to resemble a pile of rocks in your artwork. And I even showed this practice sketch that did not turn out as well as my other one because I got a little hard edged with some of my lines here, and I started to think this part of the fabric looked like a fish. It just got away from me a little bit there. So we talked about softening our lines. We talked about some adjectives that we might associate with fabric or drapery. Flowy, soft, smooth, billowing, and fluid was one I wrote in all caps because I love that word. And I feel like that really describes how we want our lines to be. We want them to be soft and smooth and fluid, and billowing is a nice word, but might be kind of difficult to keep your lines soft. But I talked about how if you have to exaggerate and leave things out of your drawing in order to capture that softness, then that is a much better way to go than forcing it to be a way that is going to make it feel hard edged or maybe like a pile of rocks. So that is a key point to remember as we get into it with the pen and ink tonight, because we're not going to be able to erase our lines once we start drawing with the pen and ink, and it's going to be even more challenging to keep things soft and flowy. So we're going to do a little bit of practice first with our ink pens just to get comfortable with creating some marks on the page that are going to feel soft and fluid and flowy and like fabric. And it wasn't that long ago that we were doing some practice like this, because last month we did these classes using pen and ink, looking at extreme value on the same illustration paper. So if you missed that class, that's one to check out as well. And I still have my drawing from that at the front of my illustration paper. So I'm just going to get a fresh sheet of illustration paper going here. And we're going to do some practice with the pens just to get comfortable. And then we'll get started drawing this drapery again. Okay, so all of these pen nibs have different numbers on them, showing how thick and thin the nibs of the pen are. So the smaller the number, the smaller the pen nib. So the ones that have a 00 in front of them are going to be smaller than the ones that don't. So this is my 005 pen, and I'm just going to make some marks with that to see how thin that pen is. If you want to do the same thing, we're going to be using a lot of hatching and cross hatching lines here tonight. And if that's new to you, Rich can drop my link to a playlist that the Michaels folks made with a lot of my classes. And there is one on pen and ink shading techniques that would be extremely helpful to you if all of this is brand new to you. It is using 4 different photographs of a lime. And first we drew the contours of the lime, and then we added all 4 of these shading techniques to them. So this is the 0.1 nib. This is probably one of my favorite ones to default to. It's just going to give you a little bit thicker line than that smaller nib. So I'm just making some marks with that, and I'm starting to curve some lines so I can get a sense of making some soft billowing lines with the pen and ink. And I'm definitely going out of order here. I'm just grabbing whichever pen is in front of me. Okay, so that was the 0.1, and this is the 1.0. So this one's definitely a lot thicker. And you don't have to be using the exact same pen as me if you, at the moment, if you want to just take your pens out and start making some marks like this with your pens and familiarizing yourself with the thick and thin values that you're going to be able to get with each of these pens. Just seeing the difference between the different marks that will be made. This is the 0.8. And the ones that are thicker nibs definitely can be useful for filling in these really dark values that we're going to have in the fabric. But I find it's just a personal preference. I really enjoy uh, building up my values with a smaller nib. So I used a lot smaller nibs for most of this work, and I tend to do that a lot because I just prefer the way that it looks. But the thicker nibs are definitely going to get the job done faster. This is the 0.5, somewhere in between that 1 and 8. It can be a little confusing how those numbers are until you. Okay, I already did the 1.0. No, it's the same thing again. Here is a 0.3, 0.3. That's a nice one for my preference as well. Doing a little bit of dots too. So even though I used a lot of hatching and cross hatching on this example, you're welcome to use any of those 4 value shading techniques. So there's hatching, which is the one directional lines, cross hatching, which is where we cross back over and go multiple directions with our lines. Stippling is the dots that overlap to get the darker values. And then we've got scribbling, which could also be very nice with the drapery because it can help to soften things if the hatching and cross hatching is making things too rigid for you. And we'll definitely do some practice with these, actually drawing the drapery so that everybody feels the most comfortable before we move on to the final drawing, because I know it can be scary drawing something like this with pens. And then this is the smallest, or one of the smaller ones, 003, similar to that 005. So very faint lines. This will be great for those lighter values. So if you want to start out with these lighter nibs like this, that way the marks that you're making, even though they're not going to be erasable since it's pen, they're still going to be light enough that they don't overwhelm you, so you can build up to those darker values as we go. And this one might be running out of ink a little bit here, which sometimes can be nice because it can be helpful to use one that's running out of ink. Let me see if I can find another one that's not like that. 003. They definitely can run out the fastest since they're so faint, or you got to be careful not to press too hard on them because you can shove that nib up inside of the pen too far, and then it doesn't work. So you gotta be careful with your pressure that you're putting on those pens. Okay, so and then just a quick value scale here. I'm gonna take out one of my favorite pens again, this 0.1. I feel like it's just the Goldilocks pen for me. Just my opinion, my preference, but I like one that's not too light, not too dark for drawing with pens because I can really layer it up. So I'm going to do a value scale here, just, a little one from 0 to 10. So this is our value scale from 0 to 10, 10 being our absolute white or our blank paper. And 10 being the absolute black. All right, and then just doing some one directional hatching lines here. So to get to a solid black, we want to keep overlapping those lines. And I'm just going one direction. With those one direction that you go with hatching lines, they're still going to follow those contours or those elevational shifts as we're drawing. And then to get our lighter values to happen. Actually, let me make this a cross-hatching value scale so it'll go a little faster. Definitely goes faster when you can go multiple directions with your lines. So for the absolute 10 value, we want no paper peeking through. We want it to be solid black. So I overlapped some cross-hatching to get this solid black here or to get this super dark here, although it might be more of like a 9 on the value scale in some of those places because there is a little bit of white paper peeking through. And then the midtones, we're looking for something pretty evenly spaced. So when we get to the middle here, we want something that feels in between absolute black and blank paper. So sometimes I think it's easier to go to the middle of the value scale and then go back and blend out from there to see how we can start to fade the values from dark to a mid-tone. It's getting there. Take some time. And this would definitely go faster if I pulled out one of those thicker nibs. So if I jumped to my 1.0 and I just wanted to do it that way so you could see the difference between, oh wait, so it's this is another 0.1. Here's a 1.0. So these fatter nibs, they're definitely going to get the job done faster, but I am not a big believer in faster being better, or even that finished is the goal. So, I mean, it's going to get it there faster, but I think that gradual shift using the lighter nib can just be more fulfilling to me personally. But you can definitely see that when I switch to this thicker nib, it's going a lot faster to fill in those blank spaces and just get it done faster. And then for the lightest values, and it really just depends on you and your personal preference as you're drawing, what you like as far as how it looks, and then also the ease of drawing. And maybe you do like to get the job done faster, and that's the most important thing to use when you use the bigger nibs. But for the lightest values, we definitely want to use those lighter pens. We want to let up on our pressure, and we want to fade out those lines so that they just visually fade to blank paper. So that could be more implied lines, lines that kind of disappear, or that just trail off and become lighter, less pressure, or just smaller. So obviously that's a lot easier to do with these smaller nibs than with the thicker nibs. Okay, any questions about just getting started and then the nibs of the pens or that value scale before I move on to drawing the drapery? Seeing any? Okay, so I'm gonna go to a new blank page. And we're gonna make our little frame here and get started. And I said we would do some practice with the drapery, but I'm looking at the time and I think let's just dive in because honestly, uh sometimes I want to do as much practice as possible to make people more comfortable, but then I don't want us to run out of time where we can't develop this further. And if we think about this as everything that we do is a practice or an exercise or a study, and we don't put pressure on ourselves to have some amazing, perfect final product, we're usually better off anyway. So let's not put any unnecessary pressure on ourselves. We can always start over, just like I'll keep showing you this one that I did first that I just wasn't happy with and decided to start over. Another thing that I didn't like about this one was I went all the way black in that shadow because I was looking at one of the reference pictures where the contrast was turned up really high. And then I thought, that would have such a better visual impact and look more realistic if we could still see some light in there, because in the regular black and white image, we talked about this last week with the graphite, you can still see it. So that's a little more interesting to me than just making it solid black. So when I started over, I made sure to keep that a little lighter as well. There's the brush. I'm going to use a little 5x7 mat board that I have here to sketch a frame. You can use a ruler if you'd like, or if you have a postcard, that's what I suggested last week. A postcard or even a piece of junk mail might be postcard size. We want a nice rectangle here, and I'm just going to trace it in pencil, and I'm going to sketch it in pencil really quickly, but then jump in with the pens. Okay, I got my frame. And then we're going to look at the highly contrasted image, the one where the shadows go to almost black here, and the biggest shadows. And that's what we're going to draw, is just these shapes that are showing up here to get started. We're not going to fill them in with our pencil or anything. We're just going to draw the empty shapes, and then we're going to jump in with the pens. And if you feel more comfortable sticking with the pencil for a while, you do whatever's most comfortable for you. The other thing you might look at is the inverted light image, and just draw the shapes that you're seeing there in white, because those are going to tell you where the black shadows are, because it's inverted and it's reversed there. I'm going to keep looking at that black and white one, and I want to get those shapes as accurate to how I'm seeing them in the photograph as possible, just so that I don't get lost. I want to keep everything nice and light and soft. And if you can't see my pencil lines right now, just give me one moment and I will go over all of these with pen in just a bit. I just want to give myself the opportunity to erase here as I get started. Although I used to teach a class, an in-person class here in Austin at the Doherty Art Center for many years, called Ditch Your Eraser. I don't teach there anymore. I teach at the Contemporary Austin for my in-person classes now. And then I also have classes out of my studio. But anyway, that class, Ditch Your Eraser, I always joked, should have been called Learn to Depend on Your Eraser a Little Less, but that wasn't as catchy of a title as Ditch Your Eraser. But the class was on learning to draw with pen and ink. And we did use pencils and erasers in the class, but we did a lot of exercises where I encouraged people to draw with the pen only, so that they could embrace the sketchy quality of drawing with pen and ink, that we can use a permanent mark making tool for impermanent practice. It's all about our mindset, how we're approaching it. So I have definitely drawn drapery like this in pen first, and it turned out okay. But nothing wrong with starting in pencil first, just to be the most comfortable. And just in case I need to shift anything from my early sketch here. So I'm just looking at those absolute dark values. I missed one. And if the geography of these shapes is really off, I would erase and draw them again. So that's why I wanted to do them in pencil first. And if that's happening to you, if you realize that that happens, I highly recommend erasing and just doing it again, because we really have to rely on this reference image quite a bit, since, like I said, we probably don't have a stock image in our brain of what drapery folds look like, or fabric folds. So it's really helpful if your reference can be as close to your drawing as possible, so that you're not having to add or imagine things that aren't there. Okay, and then if your drawing is super dark with your pencil, mine, I'm not too worried about mine, but you might just take your eraser and just erase the top layer of the pencil so that it doesn't get in the way. You can always erase it later underneath your pen if it is. Okay, and then it's good to have that little scratch paper off to the side as we work here in case you forget or I mean, we have it right here, but I don't know if you just want to test out your pen one more time and just see what you're working with before you start drawing with it. So I'm gonna start with a very small nib, like I suggest that you do too. And for that 005. So the 005 or the 003 are great ones to start with. Wow, it's hiding from me right in front of me somewhere. Oh my goodness. There it is. Okay. So even though I'm using the smallest nib, I'm still going to start in the darkest areas. And actually, I'm going to send a forward-facing view for just 1 second, just to give you a tip about how to keep these lines nice and soft and fluid and billowy and all that good stuff. Okay, so as you're drawing, I want you to use your whole arm movement. So I want everybody to practice for just 1 second on your practice paper. I want you to try to lock your wrist a little bit and get your elbow out. This is going to feel awkward if you don't usually draw like this. And I want you to just make some big sweeping movements, just using your whole arm. And maybe do some figure eights like this to warm up. Just sketch some figure eights. But notice how my entire arm is activated as I'm doing that. So I'm using the movement of my arm, not just the movement of my hand. And that is really how you're going to be able to control the pressure on your pen as you're drawing. And that's how you're going to be able to get this loose, sweepy, fabricy fold, flowy, fluid lines to happen. So I'm going to be doing a lot of that as I'm drawing, and I just wanted to demonstrate that where you could see my arm moving, because you're only going to see my hand moving as I'm drawing, and it might not be so obvious that that's the movement that I'm making. Okay, so I'm looking at these darkest values and my elbow is out. My hand is not fully rested on the table. So it's really bicep workout. You didn't know you were going to be getting but it was arm day in your drawing class, but it is. So sometimes putting your pinky out can kind of help you keep that hand off the paper and just get those sweeping movements to happen. And if that is too awkward for you, then just try to keep it nice and light and loose and light as possible. So I'm just going to go through and just get some nice big sweeping implied lines. I'm not putting my pen down all the way in these moments. I just want to be able to get rid of these pencil lines as quickly as possible. So the less I rest my hand on my drawing and the more I keep my entire arm moving, I think the easier it is to not get too hard and rigid with your lines. And I want to be able to erase these pencil lines and still have you see these early lines in the drawing, because we're not drawing with pencil for this one. We're using the pen and ink. But I'm using that smallest nib and I'm bouncing around and being nice and light with my arm movements as I'm drawing, because I also don't want a hard edged line around all of these darkest values. I want it to be nice and loose and light so that I can build up on top of it. Even right now, I know it looks like my hand is, like my wrist is the one that's doing the work, but I can tell you that my elbow is out and my arm is the one controlling the movement. So there's a little flick of the wrist, but to keep it nice and smooth and from being a hard-edged line, and to keep it flowy, you want that sort of movement going. Okay, hopefully I've convinced you to do that. I know it's awkward when we're not used to drawing like that. Okay, so now I'm going to start to look at these elevational shifts that we talked so much about last week and start to build up my lines going in the direction of the the shifts or the contours here. So we talked about this curve that was happening and how we can even look at the stitching of this linen fabric and see how it is curving in a way that is rounded inside of this fold. So we can literally just draw what we're seeing in that inside of that fold. Or inside of this cave. I was joking last week that it can be helpful to give names to the various folds and recesses in fabric. And I called this one after one of my favorite regulars in our group, Barbara, the Cave of Barbara. And she's always pinned at the top there on my on my Zoom. So we've got some roundness happening in here. And if a couple of lines happen like that, I don't know if you can tell, I just kind of made a wonky line. That's okay. We can cover that up because this is going to be super dark. So this is where in that Ditch Your Eraser class, I tried to get people to just loosen up and not worry so much about imperfect moments happening in a pen and ink drawing, because the more we continue building on those lines, the less you're going to notice that. So there's going to be so much going on that a little wonky, imperfect line is not the end of the world, especially in an area where it's going to end up pretty dark. Now, if a line happens in a place where you need it to be light and that happened, then just take a deep breath. I would leave it alone, go to a different part of the drawing and focus your energy there in a different part of the drawing for a while, and then come back to it. And you basically have two options when it comes to a permanent unintentional mark. I don't like the word mistake, as I think there's intentional and unintentional, and we can turn the unintentional into something that feels more intentional. So that might be a moment where you do add in an imagined little fold there and you keep it pretty minimal if possible, and just make it look like that mark was supposed to be there. And if that is not possible, then you can just not do anything and just let it be there, and maybe people won't even notice it in your drawing, that little slash mark or dot or whatever. Like my cat loves to jump on my desk while I'm drawing and rub her face against my drawing utensil, and sometimes she makes me make a mark that I don't want to be there. I could just leave it alone and then it could be a cute little story like, well, what's that line over there? Well, that was my cat helping me draw. So yeah, just ignoring it, just leaving it alone. Maybe people won't even notice. Or you could start over, but I don't think that's always necessary. It just depends on the mark. Most of the time it can be camouflaged or made to look intentional, or when it's all said and done, it maybe is not as noticeable as you think it will be. Okay, so I've been using this 005 the whole time, and you can tell I'm really starting to build up these values in this area, but I think now would be a good time for me to switch to that other nib that I like so much, the 0.1, just to start to get a little thicker and darker in some of these areas. And I'm going to focus my energy on this little moment where this fold over happens. And I also like to change the direction that I'm approaching the paper quite a bit so that my hand is sometimes coming in from the top of the page or sometimes from the bottom of the page, whatever makes sense to guide your movements in the direction of the elevation shifts. So we're still trying to get this roundness to come across inside of here, this little billowing bulge that's happening. So I'm using different directional lines that all curve in those directions, but then in some places it's more of a diagonal shift. And if I start to feel myself getting too stiff, like I was resting my hand on the table a little bit there, that's when I pick up my arm. It just helps keep things loose and flowy and fluid. And also, if you feel like you're overworking in a certain area, then that's a good time to bounce around and focus your energy somewhere else in the drapery. So I feel like that's getting to a point where I don't know, I'm not loving it yet. So if I feel like, that's not working just yet, I don't like to double down and keep pushing it. That's when I want to go somewhere else and spend my energy somewhere else and then come back to it with fresh eyes. And I can tell y'all that is a practice that is not easy to develop. That, what I just said, like hearing myself say that and thinking how I know that's really hard to do. I know it's really hard to recognize, hey, I'm not happy with this. And if I stay here and keep doing this, I'm going to overwork it. Using restraint is the only thing I feel like I can't teach as an art teacher. It just comes with practice. So there is a slight curve that I'm seeing here. And we talked about this when we talked about that elevation last week and how it sort of like I had the curve going that way. And then the more I look at it, it's actually going this way. So hopefully this doesn't create confusion visually, but I'm going back the other way. I think it's going to become so dark that it's not going to matter. Putting that little curve inward happening there, and then I'm noticing how it starts to curve up over this lip. And if that is not clear to you, you missed last week's class, that's something that was in the first class where we talked about all of the elevational shifts. across this particular image. And as I said before, I could pull out my thicker nib and quickly get these solid black moments to happen, but gradually building them up just creates so much more depth, because there's so many of these lines that are going to be suggesting the shift in elevation. And if you want to see some really incredibly detailed hatching and cross hatching marks, you should look at 18th century engravings. Like one that comes to mind, I've got a big book on my shelf. I'm looking over here to see if it's on my shelf here. I think it's at home. Uh the artist is Hogarth. So they're etchings that were done on copper plates using a tool, a mark making tool. I'm looking, nope, it's not here on my shelf. Anyway, any 18th century engravings. I just happen to have this big book of Hogarth engravings that I used to bring to show my Ditch Your Eraser students. There's just so much intricate detail built up with all these tiny little hatching and cross hatching lines. And you can see there are little imperfect moments. You can see there are some moments where the burr, the etching tool kind of got away from them, and but it's so detailed and there's so many marks that it doesn't jump out at you unless you look really closely. And I mentioned that my work that I do with calligraphy ink, that all started with just drawing with pen and ink like this and really getting in there and developing patience with the medium of ink. And it requires a lot of patience, I think. Okay, so in some of these places, like over here on the drapery, it is a little more straight, although I do see more of a curve there. But the more I look at it, we could start to curve some of these lines. So the more we curve the lines, the more it's going to feel rounded and billowy right there. So take notice of that. And then strategically staying in the darkest shadows right now to try to build up my confidence and hopefully building up your confidence in these darker areas, because it definitely gets a little scarier in the lighter areas, and we really want to have that loose, confident mark making happening as we get into the lighter areas. And you'll start to see that the more you build up, like eventually right here, it's starting to get pretty black. It does feel like it's never going to get to a solid black when you use that small nib, but it eventually does. You just keep overlapping it. And now I'm starting to get that really dark black right there. Although it also wouldn't hurt, looking at the time. Like, now that we're creeping up on 7 o'clock, let me pull out my 1.0 and get some darker lines happening. Oh, that's my point one again. There it is. Oh, actually, I'm like, ooh, forgot how thick that 1.0 is. Maybe my point 3. That's a comfortable in between. Okay, yeah. Depending on which image you're looking at as you're drawing, if you were to do this entire drawing looking at this image, you really would mostly have just the absolute dark areas and then just a little bit of light. So that would be an easy way to cut some corners to not have all of these midtones in there so much and just focus on the absolute dark and light. That would be a lot like what we did a few weeks ago with the stippling of those flower studies. I turned up the contrast on those images so that it was a lot of absolute dark and absolute light areas. So we didn't really have to draw a lot of midtones. But y'all are probably finding what a lot of students find about drawing drapery is that it is a challenging subject. It is not for the faint of heart. But just stick with it because I think the difference between a student's unsatisfactory drapery sketch and a satisfactory one is to keep going with it, to keep developing it, and to keep adding more to it because the more you build up these values, the more you can get that dramatic thing that we're going for to happen. So don't give up with it. I'm gonna switch back to a smaller nib because I feel like that dark one is taken over a little bit too much here. And I want to start to get some of these mid-tone areas to happen. So I'm curving my lines here because there's that curve. It might be kind of hard to see them, but the more I add, they'll start to become clear. And I'm noticing this curve over emphasized this a lot last week with the graphite. You start to get this nice medium shadow that's happening here. It's kind of a medium dark shadow that folds like this and then does that. And since the elevation curves here and then becomes a little flatter right here, I'm going to use a diagonal hatching line to start to build up the value of that shadow. And then just keeping it real loose, even though I am kind of resting my hand on the page. I'm coming in from the bottom of the page with these marks. I'm still trying to let the movement come from my whole arm there. Maybe come back this direction with some diagonal hatching lines. And then make sure that I loosely start to curve right here so that you feel that soft elevational shift that's happening. And we definitely want this to be a small nib value that we're building up here so that we can get it to a medium midtone, but it feels like it belongs there underneath this heavier shadow. Because we can see this fold inside of there, but there's still a shadow falling across it. So we want it to be believable as far as the light goes. And it would be very easy if I used a darker nib to just accidentally make that too dark. But with the smaller nib, I can just slowly build that up so that I can control how dark it's getting and keep it from getting too dark too fast. And maybe even leave it alone for a minute and come back to it. And then there's this other little fold inside of here that I described as like the head of a needle last week, this little shape. And same idea here. We want, let me zoom in on this moment in the image. So we want a slight little curve happening here inside of that shadow and another fold. It overlaps on top of that fold we were just focusing on. It creates a little cast shadow. Shadow inside of a shadow. Got like 3 shadows inside of each other here. I don't see Joyce tonight in my little pinned people, but last week I was calling this Joyce's fold. Oh, well, there's Sue Johnson. She's one of my favorite regulars. Since Joyce isn't here, this is now Sue's fold. I find that just focusing on 2 or 3 moments like this in a drapery drawing can really start to sell it to the viewer. It can really start to feel like drapery, especially if I just cover up everything else that's happening here. Let's say some of these areas are not really convincing as drapery yet, but right here where I've been focusing this energy, boy, that is really feeling like fabric folded on itself. So it may seem really annoying or frustrating or tedious or whatever word you want to use to get in there and put these painstaking details like that and notice, or you may think it doesn't matter that your lines are curving in that particular direction according to the elevation, but it really makes such a difference in the end doing that way. Because now just where I've focused this energy the most is where it's really feeling fabricy. So if we do that everywhere, we're gonna have some convincing fabric. My goodness, I have a fly in my studio and it really likes me. Keeps landing on me. I don't like it. Okay, and there's a flat moment right here. I had a stack of books underneath this drapery when I photographed it, so you can tell it's resting along the side of a book here. So it's becoming more flat. So that's where we can have some straight lines. And that's going to tell the viewer looking at our drawing that it's flat right there. And then that in relationship to the curves is going to make this optical illusion of fabric come across even more. And I'm pressing down on my pen a little more where there's that hard line here, but even instead of pressing down and doing a hard line right here, here's what I can do instead. I can go along this edge and do just a little flicky motion of some hatching lines. And really using my whole arm to flick like that. And then I can come back on top of it and do it in the other direction, going down. So I get a little implied cross hatching moment there. And then that's just a really subtle implied line for that entire fold. And then that's also starting to describe that linen stitching pattern too, which I'm scrolling through our attendees to see if Diana is here again tonight. She had such a gorgeous drawing of this fabric last week in graphite. She really emphasized that linen stitching. I'm not seeing her. Anyway, that was lovely. If you were here in the first class last week in part 1. And then this is a good moment to start to erase the rest of my pencil lines right here because they're starting to get in my way. Honestly, I can just still see them and they're distracting me as far as what's pencil and what's pen. I'm going to get rid of those. And I probably don't really need them anywhere else. And then this is fun when I erase them to see how implied I kept my pen in other areas. Like it really is starting to come across like drapery now. Okay, where am I going to focus my attention next? Let's do this fold over here. Let's see. Oh, this is going to be Autumn's fold. Autumn is another regular who comes to many of these classes and always does beautiful work. I think it was the flower studies recently that I was just so blown away by your drawings, Autumn. They were really just had a quality. I bet your art teacher is thrilled to have you as a student. I know I am. Okay, so in Autumn's fold right here, we've got this triangle above it, and I was avoiding this on purpose because this is a tricky moment, kind of like over here, because we've got the shift from a darker, it's the same fold, but the light's hitting it more directly right here. So there's a slight shadow, and then it fades from like a 7 or 8 on the value scale to a 2 or a 3. And then especially down here, if we look at it in the overly contrasted image, it really jumps from dark to light. So anyway, we just want to have this very light moment happening there coming out of the darkness. And so I'm going to use that smaller nib. I just didn't want to start with anything like this because I find most of us tend to be more heavy-handed than we are too light with our marks. So this is where we really want that whole arm movement to happen and that little flick of the wrist. And then just getting that subtle. So it's really light right now because I'm using the 003 nib. And then I want it to slightly curve here too, so that you get that little like peek under the covers sort of moment where that fold is like standing up on its own. And then I want it to be a little darker here in the corner, so it's coming out of the darker area of that fold. So yeah, it's not too scary. Just didn't want to start with that because it felt a little tricky for us. And then right here, same thing, we did it over here. I think this action will be really nice instead of drawing a line here. So we're going to imply the line by doing just a little cross hatching at the edge. And we're going to read it as a line, even though we didn't actually draw a line right there. And this might actually be kind of fun to do a little stippling right here. I didn't do any stippling in the last one, but I'll admit I was inspired by Diana focusing so much on that linen stitching. It definitely wouldn't hurt to put some of the stitching in there, and the stitching kind of comes across as little dots, more like stippling, but it's like a graph of dots. So if you do those little cross hatching lines, then you can see where the dots need to go to line up with each other and follow that stitching pattern. And that could be another nice subtle way to imply the value there without doing a hard line. Because remember, if we do those hard lines, it's not going to feel soft and billowy. It's going to feel hard and stiff. So the softer we can be, and the more we can imply those lines. And actually, now that I started doing that, now I want to do it in other areas. I'm just looking at that stitching pattern and how I can see those little circles and putting some of those in there. I'm adding some cross-hatching lines while I'm in there too. Oh yeah, we could do it across this little fold too. So it's kind of gonna be like the circles are like a brick pattern. They're gonna alternate across each row. The dots are gonna show up in between the dots above them. So if you wanted to add some of those dots, I think that would be a nice way to start to imply that pattern. And that might really help you to see, to follow the contours too. When I used to teach high school and I would do this fabric lesson, the particular classroom that I was teaching in, I inherited a lot of stuff from the art teacher before me. And she had this whole box full of all these different patterned fabrics. And I always made a point to use plain fabrics with my students and not, I thought patterns would make it more challenging. But then I realized actually the patterns can really help, because if there's a plaid pattern or a striped pattern, then that stripe is going to be curved by that elevational shift. And so sometimes that can really help people to draw the pattern. So if it feels overwhelming to try to put that linen stitching pattern in there, maybe don't do it. But for some of you, if you try it, you might discover that it actually makes it a little easier to create that optical illusion. So maybe just put it in there a little bit and see what happens. I think this pen is drying up on me. That's my 003 that was already looking kind of, where's that 1.0 again? Okay, yeah, and then actually, I'm going to switch back to 005 or a lighter one again to get this nice. Since we focused on this area so much, I want to really develop this area before we run out of time. So I'm putting this cast shadow that's falling across, and I want this to be really soft. And just noticing that little curve over the side of that. But I want it to be like this mid-tone over here. So once I get these initial contours in there, I'm going to try to quickly build up to a mid-tone, or maybe like a 3 or a 4 on the value scale. And then here at the edge, I need this one to be darker. I need all of these folds to be darker. I'm just making sure that as I'm adding, building up the value, that I'm following that curve. And then on the horizontal axis here, it's just pretty straight lines. And that can start to disappear when I build those up too much. So I got to push that shadow in between those two folds. Pressing down a little more in that area. It's so funny how when I plan these classes, I have a system where I figure out what I'm gonna do. And if it's a drawing class, I'll park myself on my couch and just binge watch a TV show or whatever and just draw on the couch so I'm just having flashbacks to like the show I was watching while I was drawing these folds before, because whatever content I was consuming was just seeping into my brain, and that moment is now associated with these fabric folds for me. It's funny how that works. You'll have to tell me in the chat if you have that same experience drawing something where now every time you look at that drawing, you think about the audiobook or the music you were listening to. I've been watching a lot of true crime documentaries lately. I won't tell you the content of the show that I was just flashing back to, but it just occurred to me. That's what was coming to mind. Rich, do we have any fun responses to that question? Oh, I see Jasmine
We
just said yes with music.
Yeah, with music. Heather says that she has that with gardening. She was listening to a historical book on Henry VII, and every time I go near the crab apple tree, I remember.
Oh, that's awesome.
And Autumn says with cooking shows like that, the smooth line looks like frosting.
Oh, nice. Funny, this painting that is one of my most popular paintings that I have on my business card. Painted that in 2018. I was listening to one of my favorite books of all time on audio while I painted it, Jane Eyre. So I don't know, it's just funny because it's got such a cosmic theme to it, but that's my Jane Eyre painting. I think before we run out of time, I want to just really drive these dramatic moments a little further. Get some of these shadows, these subtle shadows that are happening near the most dramatic parts of the drawing. I'm doing that little implied line thing along that shadow. And yeah, I've still got the 005, so I'm going to start to get some of these other shadows in here, even though I might not have time to fully develop them. I might be intentionally avoiding the part of the drawing that I made look like a fish the last time, but I'll get in there and put a little bit on that particular fold. I mean, honestly, I was joking about this last week. It does kind of look like there's a fish wrapped in there. It was really a challenging part of this drawing, especially the first time I did it with the pen and ink. And then I did that thing that I was saying I try not to do, where I doubled down and overworked it. I'm just trying to get a little bit of that subtle light value to happen in some areas where there's some fun mid-tone folds happening, and the more I push those, the more those will show up on the Zoom screen. But in my drawing right now, I feel like I don't want it to be too dark there because it is pretty light in that moment. So I'm just gonna leave it alone, leave it nice and light. And then I really just will need to blend out near the edge of it so that it's not just sitting there. Blend into the darker areas nearby. Mm, Get at least this little moment right here. So curve. Now that I'm all super warmed up by the end of it, I feel or by the end of our time together, I'm feeling pretty confident to put some of these things in nice and loose. But if I had started with this, maybe it would have come across a little stiff in some moments. So good to know your limits and know yourself and how you work. Definitely after years of working with pen and ink, it still gets kind of scary to draw certain things for me. So I just know if I start out light in the darkest areas and build up with a small nib, because there's no rush, then after I've been drawing for a while, I'll be loosened up, and confidence will be a little stronger, and it'll be easier to get in there and do some of these subtle, light, flowy moments without being too stiff about it. And if you still feel like when you're trying to do this, it's too stiff and you're not able to get it to feel the way you want it to, then I would just leave it alone. Just leave it kind of blank and focus more on these really dramatic areas. And that's why I included one of those reference images where it was more blown out like that, because this would definitely be a more simplified way to draw this. It would be more like these flower studies with mostly the dark and light values being the focus. The darkest darks and the darkest lighter shadows. So even though there are some lighter moments in that one, the lightest areas just kind of disappear. So you don't have to worry about them. All right. Well, I think that just about does it. I'm switching back to my other one here, although I'm looking at this shadow area right here, and I'm really liking how I drew that particular moment a little better than this one, even though this one's more developed. I really like that subtle shift in my light there compared to there. I can tell I studied it a lot more through all these drawings we did together. Um, oh, I see Andrew had a question. How do I feel about a drawing glove for techniques like this? One that can prevent smears, possibly. Uh, yeah, if you're comfortable wearing a glove while you draw, that can be a good idea. Or you can put a piece of paper under a blank piece of paper under your hand as you draw. Um, I wasn't really having any smears happening with my pen tonight, so that wasn't an issue for me. But with the graphite, definitely that can be an issue. So I think I did that last week, having a piece of paper underneath my hand to keep smearing from happening. Oh, Andrew's saying you do have some smears happening. So yeah, maybe a piece of paper or a glove if you can still draw with a glove on that might, but then I feel like the glove might also smear things. But the piece of paper might just keep your hand from coming in contact with it, with the drawing. All right, so would anybody like to hold up their drawing for us to spotlight you? so we can see how you did with this.
Getting through them here. All right, we've got autumn.
Oh, let's see, Autumn. Oh, yes, look. That's your one from last week too. Wow. Yeah, you're just so good with the graphite, and your pen and ink is also so nice and soft. Yeah, I'm really feeling the softness to all of those folds and lines. Just beautiful. Okay, and oh, it's Barbara. My window was in the way of your name. Oh, yes, look at that. Oh, that one little the fold, the Joyce's fold or Sue's fold is really coming across there too. That is beautiful. Oh, I'm just feeling those nuanced shifts happening so nicely. That's so fun. This is Karen. Okay, yeah, just keep going, Karen. Just, in those areas where it maybe feels a little disconnected, those transitional moments will really bring it together because I'm feeling like a river of some folds overlapping each other in a lot of moments. And I think just that jump from dark to mid-tone, if you ease that together, but blend that together, it's really going to come across. That's lovely. This is Artemis. Oh, I think you got to turn off your blurry background. It's gonna blur everything but your face. It's always a frustrating Zoom feature for this.
If you hold it at a bit of an angle, you might be able to catch it. There you go. Angle it backwards.
Maybe we can come back. And you can turn off your background blur and we'll come back to you.
I'm kind of scrolling through to see who's left. Anybody left? Last call?
Oh, I know, I feel like kind of a smaller group tonight, actually. Maybe we don't have anybody else.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. Oh, wow, that was worth the wait. Yeah, look at that. Holy moly. That is really convincing. In Sue's fold or Joyce's fold. See how helpful that is? Y'all wouldn't know what fold I was talking about, but we named them so we know. That is just so lovely, so gratifying. I feel like I say it every time lately, but y'all just always had such amazing work to share these last several classes, and it just makes my day. All right, well, thank y'all so much, and I'll be back in, I guess, 3 weeks, the last Wednesday of the month, and we'll do part one of that flower study in gouache. And thank you, Rich, as always, and everyone have a wonderful evening. See you next time.